So we heard from Al earlier today at CTO of Virtua, and you, by the way, the panel you're about to hear from is on cloud computing. And I was very eager when Al accepted the invitation to come to the conference because he's one of those rare breed of hospital CTOs. Well, let me back up a little bit. Again, this is sort of a level-setting conference in a lot of different ways, and many of you are acutely aware, and some may be unaware of the way the sort of hospital information system hierarchy works. But, currently in the world out there, there's one company, Epic, which is in many ways dominating big health system implementations. Cerner is right up there. Allscripts Eclipsys appears to have been doing doing its very best to sort of destroy itself, and beyond that, you've got Siemens and GE and Meditech, perhaps sort of in that order of market share. But the bottom line is that in the last few years, interoperability and single source shopping for very big systems, and an Epic implementation could be $300-400-500 million in 3 or 4 years. But the interoperability has replaced best of breed and functionality in the priority of CTO. So Al stands fairly alone, among or as a member of a very small peer group of folks who have the skills and vision to build it themselves. So I'm telling the following story with all extreme due respect to his capabilities and insight. So over the past few years, as you heard, Al has been building from a greenfield a 6-hospital system with fully integrated platforms and just an unbelievably high and ambitious level of functionality. And about a year ago, he gave me a tour of his main data center. And at the end, we went down into the basement, and there he threw open the doors, and stretching before us with fluorescent lights and raised platform floors were just racks of servers as far as the eye could see, with the racks for cabling neatly arrayed around the top. And he showed us his double redundant fire suppression systems and his 2 different types of power backups, the centrifuge, what do we call the type that? Yes, the flywheel-based backup and the natural gas generators. And I'm looking at this, and it's like a scene out of 2001, A Space Odyssey, when the guy goes to disable Hal's brain. And I'm looking at this whole thing, and it is a dazzling array, but I couldn't suppress the thought, Al, have you heard of the internet? You can buy your storage on the spot market at this week's prices. You don't have to own all this stuff. You don't have to do these things. And I think there's a tendency to, when you tell that story, it might sound like you're condemning Al and the people of this world as sort of these Luddites who aren't aware of what's going on. But tell the story to make precisely the opposite point. Al knows all about the internet, thank you very much, and he's still making an extremely conscious decision to build an unbelievable amount of infrastructure and take upon himself an incredible amount of extra responsibility to run this internal system. I think he called it a private cloud, which might be an oxymoron. I'm sorry, it's out there. Somebody else put it out there. But he's doing it for good reasons. Nevertheless, the raw economic compelling reasons for cloud-based systems are all around us and proliferating in every direction. And what we have on this panel, I think, is a terrific group of representative folks who are making and achieving a powerful business case in each case that are getting users and customers for how these customers, like Al, are going to migrate to web and cloud-based services. So slightly lengthy introduction, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to frame it in that context. Chris, I'll turn it over to you for the rest of the introductions.
Great. Well, Brandon would not let us have Al on 2 separate panels. So we don't actually have the skeptic with their own internal data center here. We have 3 gentlemen with me here who are very much involved in the cloud and are providing services in various ways through cloud-based systems out into the healthcare environment. My name is Christopher Austin. I'm a partner at Goodwin Proctor. I'm a technology company lawyer. I represent everything from very early stage startups up through public companies. in my career, I've done a lot of licensing for hospital systems. I've done hospital outsourcing transactions. In fact, the very first deal I ever did as a corporate lawyer was back in the early 90s, and Bell Atlantic Healthcare Systems, of all places. Now, Verizon is sponsoring today, so the phone companies are getting back into the healthcare IT area. Bell Atlantic Healthcare Systems sold basically an EHR back in those, whatever they called it back then. That became Oasis Healthcare Systems. So my very first corporate deal as a corporate lawyer was that. Suffice it to say, that was a very different system than the ones we're talking about here. So I'll do a quick introduction and then ask each of you to give a little bit more introduction about what you do. Josh Newman is at Salesforce. He's a practicing physician. He's been at Salesforce for a number of years, and he's the Director of Product Management and Health Strategy. Dan Rodrigues, founder and CEO of Kareo, which is a physician practice management solution. And then Hamid Tabatabaie is the CEO of lifeIMAGE, which is a company which allows radiologists to share images through various mechanisms. So we'll start with Josh and give yourselves a little bit of time to tell people what you're up to.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Most people know Salesforce as a software solution that enables sales. Customer relationship management, call centers are things that we're known for most. We have a platform, though, that enables all sorts of other opportunities, and my work is really focused on enabling our platform to diffuse into clinical care. And while we worked on an EMR a few years ago, we find that our sweet spot really is taking that CRM functionality, collaboration, continuity of care in the medical case, but collaboration, data aggregation, and logic and workflows, and bringing it to healthcare. So we have a HIPAA-compliant platform, one that enables HIPAA compliance, as you might say, security and sharing rules, and a lot of things that are already built in. So it enables our partners to build solutions. You heard Matt Wallach from Viva this morning. They're built on our platform. A number of other solutions are built on our platform, and we sell to hospitals, provider organizations of all kinds, and really enable them to do what they want to do and innovate quickly in the cloud.
Okay, so I'm with Kareo. I'm the co-founder and CEO. Kareo is the only medical office software really designed for the realities of small practices. So a majority of physicians today still practice in small, kind of 1 to 5 doc medical offices. Those small practices face very limited time, energy, and resources to devote to the business side of running their practice. And Kareo makes it incredibly intuitive to run their business so that the providers can focus really on patients and not paperwork. Today, we have over 12,000 physicians that are using Kareo on the Kareo platform. These are paying physician subscribers. Each doctor pays a few $100 a month for the service. We've doubled both our revenue and subscribers for each of the past 3 years, and we're also continuing to see really strong growth and adoption of the cloud within small practices.
My name is Hamid. I'm co-founder and CEO of lifeIMAGE. For the last 18 months, we have transported, shared, and have given access to about 146 million images to physicians, patients, payers. A physician can certainly open up a CD if you bring it to them on our network, as well as they can receive it electronically from Beijing as easily as they can from Bedford. Patients can have access to it for a second opinion and quickly being able to share imaging information should the diagnosis have gone the wrong way with any physician anywhere without any need for software. Or payers in the process of pre-authorizing a CT exam can decide whether or not that exam had been previously performed elsewhere and avoid the expense and the clinical delays in access to imaging information. Our business model is very simple. Those who subscribe to us pay us a monthly subscription fee for accessing and providing access to images to others, and others who need access to it don't pay anything. We tend to sell to two constituents, larger hospitals and academic medical centers, as well as payers. Consumers happen to be the beneficiary of the network by virtue of the service that our customers provide them, whether they're providers or payers.
So let's start with a little bit of definition of terms here. Since we had the private cloud comment before, and I had been talking to Linda Breeze before he came up and disparaged that as a term. For our purposes, though, we're going to talk about on-demand and cloud-based services, and they have two components from my perspective. One is as a business model. Many of them you've heard from Kareo and from lifeIMAGE that they do a subscription-based model. So rather than the old days of multi-million-dollar upfront license fees and 18 to 23% maintenance fees, they tend to be, and of course Salesforce was the very first to really get traction with a subscription model. They tend to be companies which are providing a service, and the subscription makes it's an interesting buying decision then for the customers, because the buying decision, even though there's often a 1 or 2 year contract, is a much smaller dollar outlay up front. And so there's some issues with that piece of it in terms of vendors going out and trying to sell. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then secondly, on-demand and cloud. Cloud really talks more about a delivery mechanism. And we're going to talk about cloud in its, I think probably its classic sense, which is that it's hosted on a public set of servers and storage with security. Many times it'll be multi-tenant. So many of the top cloud-based platforms are what they call single instance multi-tenant. In other words, one code base. Not a lot of customizations. If you look at some of the hospital systems that are in place right now, they have many, many iterations. People are on version 4.3.2, and they've customized that. Most people who are working on SaaS and cloud-based companies talk about we have configurable software. Nobody in SaaS software these days wants to have customizable software. It's configurable. So you might be able to configure it for things, but the idea is that as updates come, they can come regularly. Bugs can be fixed. You don't have to push out. You don't have to roll techs out to take care of it. So that's a piece of it that we're going to talk about. Data is generally stored, as I said, off-site by the vendor. One of the big questions that we'll launch off on, we'll sort of start on the negative piece first, is the question of security. One of the big questions that came up in one of the earlier panels had to do with what do we do with all this clinical data, the sensitive data, and the comment of, well, you're on AWS, Amazon Web Services, but you have to get off AWS. We have to have the data in our facility. I think that there is the one risk we have with this panel is that I think we all believe that many of these problems have been solved. If you start to look right now at what people are doing in financial services, all of your financial data is available on an iPad or a web browser anywhere you go, anytime. Everybody has become more and more used to having that personal information out there. From your perspective, and I'll let each of you speak about this. What are the big issues with data? Because obviously healthcare is a very, very different market in some ways. It's heavily regulated. The information is of the most sensitive sort. One could argue that even that my medical information is frankly more sensitive than my financial information, because I can have very, very important information about me as an individual and problems that I could potentially have, or family history issues. So how do you deal with data when you're looking at this? What are the issues that the customers talk to you about? What is your response? Where are you still finding that those responses, that there's still a lot of resistance, making it more difficult to make sales than it should be?
Maybe I'll start. I'll talk about a couple different things easily. One is, for those of you who don't feel like listening and don't feel like you have to, and you have a machine in front of you, you can go to trust.salesforce.com and see up to the minute real-time reliability of our servers. Trust is incredibly important to us, and we've been fighting this battle for about 13 years. We fought it for financial services, and we won in a lot of cases, won the credibility and the belief in a lot of folks, and we're doing the same thing in healthcare now. I think that in general, it's sort of an emotional thing. I understand. I think it's a rational fear that people have about data and putting it up in the cloud and putting it in multi-tenant spaces, and there are little niches in different places where people still haven't made the jump. But the momentum is so overwhelming that we see that happening. And for all the reasons that you mentioned, for all the economic benefits and for all the innovation benefits and the 3 releases a year benefits, and it just becomes so much more rational. And for the investors out there, a company called Rehab Care was bought by Kindred last year, And their CIO is very public about how he decreased IT costs and expenses. And the role of the CIO may be changing, that instead of amassing these enormous budgets and these enormous staffs of people and these enormous infrastructures, that maybe the role of the CIO moving forward is to shrink that footprint and to shrink the draw on the company, and that makes the company more attractive to acquisition. So we see this happening in all sorts of industries, and we see it in healthcare too. And it's very exciting for us. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, if you look at all the HIPAA violations, they all happen in HIPAA-regulated, HIPAA-compliant systems. So the security issues sometimes aren't really dependent on the technology as much as on how people use it. And when you think about which is easier to use, which is easier to implement, which is easier to train on, which is easier to innovate on, the cloud is by far more beneficial.
Let me push back on that though for a minute, because isn't one of the big complaints that, okay, so there's a HIPAA issue, but the amount of data is generally more limited on physical. So we'll start with physical records. We've gotten past that, right? Because we have electronic medical records now. What about the question, the idea that there's just so much information that if there is a breach, that the consequences are so much greater, and that frankly that each individual company should be able to take responsibility and take care of their own security? How do you deal with that?
That's
question?
true, and it's certainly a vulnerability in a multi-tenant system that's sort of obvious. But so far we've been fortunate. We work very hard at this, and because we focus on this, because trust is our core value, we realize that we have to maintain this all the time. And I think the other question that I would turn around and say, and it may be a little controversial to say, but who do you trust more with your data? An enormous software company that is focused on this as their core value, with experts that are some of the best people in the field and the best people in the world, or a hospital, or a doctor's office, or someone else? In terms of reliability, in terms of security, I think there's really no comparison. So we like to say that's our value. We like to say that there is more safety than the others. There's no 100% in anything in the world. So we just like to assure our customers that we're doing everything we can, and we're at the state of the art.
So Dan, you're in those doctors' offices. Yeah. In some ways, this is how likely is a 3-person doctor practice to actually put in every security update on time? I mean, how do you? What have you heard from them, and what kinds of horror stories have you been able to collect, sort of the pre-Kareo days?
That's a good question. So first of all, I think as a cloud solution provider, we need to first recognize that the concerns are real. I mean, this is sensitive information that we're dealing with, healthcare information, identity information, in some cases even payment information, credit cards, stuff like that. So we have to be really concerned about it. We work hard, just like Salesforce. I mean, Salesforce kind of blazed the trail here for cloud solutions like Kareo to come along. But you asked a question about small doctor's offices. I mean, it's still a pretty sorry state of affairs from an IT perspective in a small doctor's office. I mean, you still have a lot of these systems, running local client server systems on consumer grade computers that are probably about 7 to 8 years old versions of operating systems, running Windows 98, with the password taped to a monitor at the reception desk. I mean, that's security for a lot of these smaller practices. So, moving that into the cloud, yes, there is a concern about the multi-tenant architecture, but it's order of magnitude more secure, more reliable, better protection of data than what they're doing in their offices today.
I'm going to ask you, Hamid, a slightly different question having to do with...
I'd like to answer the same question.
You can answer the same question if you want to start. We'll start with that first, and then I've got another variant on it. Go ahead.
That'd be great. As a company, we happen to sign an agreement with each one of the providers that basically makes us liable. So as a CEO, I make it my business to both compare what we do on the cloud with the kind of security exists in the real world, which we all did so far. And also concerned that there are some real concerns. I can't, as a service provider, buy from Amazon a cloud service that gives me root access to the data. It just doesn't happen. They won't open up those doors. As a result, if something breaches on my cloud, I won't be able to grab all the data that I need. So I want to defend Al for a little bit, that there is some sense into a hybrid private and public cloud. So we've taken an approach that the keys to the kingdom live on the private side and the generic data that we encrypt 17 ways till Sunday on the public cloud. So there are precautions to be had. Generally speaking, I think there's a difference between data security and information security. Data security we're all very good at. Information security comes down to how you build your systems, not at the technical level, but at the workflow level. We tell a payer, for instance, that if somebody wants to get authorized for a CT, if that CT exists, you can have access to images. Now, you don't want your payer to have access to images if you have pre-existing conditions or if you don't have pre-existing conditions. So the question is, how have you set up to make sure that the right information is at the right hands, and the wrong information is, or the right information is avoided by all means at the wrong hands? I think cloud is absolutely the way of the future, but until such day that any one of us can sit up here and just like in the back of a bottle, the contents are spelled out. What is the cloud? There's a lot of marketing hype around it, and there are a lot of misinformation. So I'm more on the concerned side.
Although be careful, I understand that New York City water is probably safer than the water in the bottles here. So.
If I could read, I could tell you.
That's right. So let me flip back to you then about a second problem, which is not just data security, but also functionality on the cloud. Because one of the things that's changed a lot since a lot of us got started doing this is the ubiquity of broadband, and not just broadband, but T1 and T3 lines being accessible to people and economic. We saw at the lunchtime in the lunchtime discussion about how much data there is in images. So talk to us about how do you deal with that question? You're actually pushing stuff across. So you have a CD. That's easy, right? If I have an image, I can put on a CD, or somebody can bring an X-ray or a copy of a CT scan with them in their hand to their doctor. How hard is it for you, if you're pulling things out of the cloud, to deal with the fact that in many doctors' offices they probably don't have necessarily the best broadband connection? Are there functionality concerns about moving to the cloud that you have to deal with as you go through this, and how do you get around that?
Frankly, we see that as a diminishing concern as everybody's starting to have more and more acceptable ranges of connection to the network. But more importantly, when you're a vendor like us and you deal with 750 megabyte to 2 gigabyte files, you have to get clever around it. You have to get clever around how you stream the data to the user in a way that they can consume it at lower bandwidth. You have to get clever about not moving the data when it doesn't need to be moved. So for instance, we index the inventory of images at any facility that cares for us to index it. And as a result, when a doctor wants to know about the availability of it, you simply are showing a directory that says Mrs. Jones had an ultrasound done at this facility and a CT done at the other facility. And only when you absolutely need the data, you move the data. Third, you deal with it in a way that the new internet is letting you do that. We park the data closest to the place that it may be consumed. Majority of sharing of healthcare information happens in the proximity of about 100 to 150 mile radius. So when somebody in San Francisco is sharing an image, we park it in the closest area to San Francisco. All the database is centralized and we all know where everything lives. But the next time that data needs to be shared, we're not moving it, hauling it across the country. We're doing it much more regional. Finally, you take advantage of some smart bandwidth organizers, people like Akamai or private-public combination of internet access and private. So there's always, I like to say that when you get 4 engineers in a room, if you keep the heat up long enough, answers will show up. We can't chisel away at physics too much, but we certainly can get around some of the limitations by clever ideas.
So let's talk a little bit about the business here as we think about this beyond just the technical difficulties. And if people have questions along the way, feel free. I'd be happy to have you raise those questions. Josh, we've talked about a little bit as we were getting ready for this about the problems of data liquidity as you think about data. And one of the concerns as we've been talking through, there's huge systems, Epic, Cerner, others that are out there. There's 20 or 30 years of development behind those. There's, listen to the VA, right? So, as long as you work with our current system, that's fine because we've got X 100 million records in here and we're not going to move it. How are people dealing with that issue from a business perspective? Because it seems to me that once you get past the data security, one of the big things is, okay, well, what can you do for me that I can't already do with my system? And how do you get access to all this historical information that I have?
Good point. So for those of you that actually went to trust.salesforce.com, if you look at the bottom of that page, you'll see the number of transactions that we're doing a day, and it's approaching 800 million. About half of those are API calls. So for those of you who don't know, it's computers talking to computers. We get data in from financial services, from all sorts of different systems, and we can do it with healthcare as well, and we're doing that. It's tricky in some ways, and anyone who's been in healthcare long enough has the scars to prove it, that it's pretty tricky to get data out for the political and cultural reasons as much as the technical reasons, but that's changing. Despite some of the different strategies of some of the different companies out there, people are forcing their way into their own databases. They own their own data. They have every right to do that, and they're doing it. And they're using us for a platform. And it's reminiscent of what happened 13 years ago with Salesforce. I think when I talk to people who were around at the beginning of the company, they say things like, we hoped we would go in and have people rip out their SAP and their Oracle implementations and use Salesforce as the master customer record. And any of you who know anything about that time, that didn't happen, obviously. So from very early on, I think our company realized that we needed to play well with others and play well with existing legacy systems. Maybe over time there was a potential that we would unseat them, but certainly in the short term it was, we want to play nice with them, we want to enable them. And we have a concept that we call core versus edge. So the $100, $200, $300 million Epic implementations of some of the hospital systems that I know of in California, they're not going to get rid of that anytime soon. And that's okay, that's fine, because we don't want to be the system where people order medications or look at lab results or anything like that. But when it comes to collaborate with other people inside and outside the organization, or when it comes to workflows that don't exist inside the hospital, or when it comes to mobile applications that come because of an insightful worker who wants to come up with something and test it within months instead of years, we're a great platform. We're an edge platform, and that's where we want to be. And so we take data in, do stuff with it, and we can do that pretty confidently.
How hard is it to reach into those systems? You can have the best API in the world, and if you can't, if they've got multiple systems and they have customized databases and everything else, doesn't that start to impinge on your model of sort of easy access to data? It gets pretty expensive, I would think, to actually do that effectively.
It can. It's more expensive than it is to hook up to Amazon or Google or any of those other folks that are sort of at our level when it comes to web services. But even in hospitals, we're seeing a change. Any of you who know companies like Cloverleaf or Informatica or Cast Iron or any of these guys, there's a whole marketplace of middleware solutions that are great at this kind of thing. And they're serving CIOs and hospitals who have a real interest in doing this. The academic side all wants to get data for research, and they have to, and they do it, and they force their way in if they can't get it from the vendors, as well as for e-prescribing and for lab ordering and all this sort of thing. So the infrastructure is generally in place, and over time it's just getting more and more modern and easier to do.
Dan, I'll come back to you. But Hamid, on this one, you're basically adding additional functionality. So do you find the same issues are you trying to replace somebody else, or are you just saying, we'll give you additional functionality, we'll let you access these images online rather than having to carry films around?
I defended Al earlier, and I want to offend him. He said, we don't need your stuff. We have something similar. The fact of the matter is, wherever we go, there are some existing behaviors. 30 years of healthcare IT has told me one thing, and that's it's all about incremental adoption. It's all about bringing a small enough but valuable enough functionality to the organization. If you take a look at all the HIT vendors, whether it's Epic or otherwise, they all started as a niche. They were either a lab vendor, a pharmacy vendor, an outpatient registration vendor, and then they built around it. That's the culture of healthcare. That's how healthcare consumes IT. We tend to be a very niche solution. We tend to share imaging information. Nothing on our network stops you from sharing the entire electronic medical record. Nothing. You can append the path results, you can append the lab results, you can do discharge summaries. The entire network is available for that. But smart approach from us, for our purposes, is to be a niche vendor and expand. I think it's very much the same thing that Josh was talking about, is edge versus core. It's much harder to attack the core than it is to grab the edge and essentially become the core over time.
Right, so you come on the edge and then you make it easier and easier for people to share more and more data through you. And presumably you're charging them, somehow you figure out a charging system so that as they continue to use more data and transfer more data using your system, that you're getting paid more for it.
Presumably.
So for us, it's a little bit different. I mean, in essence, we are going in and replacing their core.
Exactly.
These are smaller organizations, so it's easier for them to do. But once you get in there, then they still are interested in getting access to that data. So I think one of the core pieces of cloud is you have to make sure you provide a platform that makes it really accessible, that data. So some of the things we do, we have an open API as well, and we're not quite at the same numbers as you are, but I think 25% of the transactions actually are going through our API, which is pretty surprising given the small organizations that we focus on. But we even provide other ways of get access to the data that are easier for more of a business user that doesn't have technical knowledge. So as an example, we have a small plugin to Microsoft Excel where you can query against your data that's in Kareo. So all those things are about really making sure that even though it's stored in the cloud, they have access to the information however they want to use it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you find with that, so I take it in that kind of an implementation, they have the API, so you keep the old data on the old system. You're not trying to actually, are you trying to convert and import things into your platform?
Yeah, so surprisingly, a lot of our customers, when they adopt our platform, they're not doing a data import. That's a service that we offer, but I think it's used by about 10% or less of our customers. So a lot of them are actually starting fresh. Some of them are using our API and a local IT person to help them import that data in on their own. But the others just start fresh, and they'll work down their AR in an older system. Surprisingly, a lot of those older systems have insurance information and things in there that are actually pretty bad data. They want to clean that. That's part of the process of migrating to a cloud. So we're seeing some interesting things there. It hasn't been a challenge in terms of the growth.
Just as a quick follow-up, the clinicians themselves much rather deal with cloud vendors because automatically it means less IT saying no to them.
Okay.
They find it liberating to deal with people who are not constrained by the backlog of things that IT has to locally deal with, the scrutiny with which IT has to perform projects. It's somewhat of a rogue behavior, but it is absolutely a reality that clinicians get much faster response time from vendors who happen to show up with a cloud offering than they do with things that have to get in the queue of implementation, and a year and a half later, maybe we'll expose it to a group of pilot people and so on and so forth. So cloud does have that sexiness going for it right now.
If I could add to that, when our company started, I think that our chairman wanted to make enterprise software look more like Amazon. And there's a whole thrust in our company to make us look and act more like consumer apps. And when we look at what we all use as consumers, if anyone uses Gmail, if anyone uses Mint.com, if anyone uses Pandora, these are all multi-tenant softwares that we all use and we all benefit from, and they're really cheap to run compared to no one's installing Pandora. And I agree with Hamid that they like it not only because of the freedom that it offers, but because it's something that we're used to, and you can sort of feel the benefit when you use it.
It's actually an interesting, broader trend in the whole IT space, which makes it so interesting.
Yes.
One of the other hats I wear is I'm the head of our IT strategy committee at our firm. We've got 6 offices internationally, and one of the things that's pushed us is that 10 years ago, people would come to the office and we had much better systems in the office than they had at home. It was faster, they had better printers and everything else. And now everybody comes into the office and they say, why can't I do what I can do at home, right? Why can't I use my iPad for everything? Why can't I do this and do that I can access? And so I do think that broader consumerization trend is something that really benefits cloud vendors because of the fact that, again, back in the day we talked about it was thin client, but thin client still required something on the system. It required a particular type of operating system to run it in. I've got access to vet notes and everything else here. It could be on my iPad. It could be on my laptop. It could be on somebody's BlackBerry. So as we look at some of these things, one of the issues we've kind of talked about a little bit is the subscription model. How does that change as you talked to me about the fact that the physicians like it? They must also like the fact they don't have to do this huge upfront outlay. It's a much easier kind of sale as you go talk to people about it. How have you guys found that? You and Dan in particular, I guess, as you've gone out to sell your solutions. Do they believe you that it really is a subscription? And then I guess that the corollary question I'm going to ask you about this is, how does it change your behavior? Because one thing I've talked to my clients who are SaaS vendors say, look, if it's an enterprise sale, I sell the thing up front, and they're pretty much stuck with it until they do another implementation. If I'm a SaaS, there's some integration issues and everything else, but I'm selling that thing every month or every year or every couple of years because it's a subscription. I don't actually make a good profit on any individual customer unless it's been in for a few years. And so they feel much more of a sales-oriented culture going forward. Have you seen that, and how does that affect your view of your customers?
So I think I'll answer that, but I'll start with back to the consumerization. I think just a small point on there. Mm-hmm. One of the things we see is, I think I saw some study that said 70% of physicians have an iPad. And oftentimes they have multiple iOS devices at home. And over the past couple of years, I think big brands like Apple have really introduced technology to providers and other folks in the healthcare market, and then they walk into their office, and all of a sudden the consumer technology that they've become used to at home, they don't get the same level of user experience, accessibility, design that they get.
They've got a green ASCII-based screen,
exactly.
right?
And so all of a sudden it really helps them imagine what's possible in the future, raises their expectation. And I think all of us, it's helping us because it helps them realize that the differentiation of a cloud solution, a more modern solution. So back to your point about the subscription pricing, I think it's, obviously for a software company, the business model initially is a lot more challenging. It requires a lot more capital up front. You are financing your customer. You can't rely on a huge software license up front and then maybe some support fees over time to help fund the growth of your business. You're having to spend huge amounts of money acquiring customers, and then hopefully you make that back within 5 months to a year, and then at that point you're starting to generate profit from the customer, and then so it's really incumbent upon us to work hard to keep those customers. So at Kareo, we're probably the most consumer-like in the healthcare market. We offer 30-day free trials. Mm-hmm. There's no upfront fee. Our customers can sign up online with a credit card. It's a month-to-month subscription. And so it's great for the customer. It's less risk. It's lower cost. They can get in quickly and see if it really works for them before making a long-term commitment. But it puts a lot more of the work onto us as a software vendor to provide great service. Because if we can't keep those customers around, it's an unprofitable business model. So I think it might be harder on cloud providers, but it makes us better software providers, and the benefits to customers are obvious.
I absolutely agree with the financing of the customer dilemma as I look at Tom McKinley, my board member, and the amount of money we spend before we get to a part that I think generally speaking, subscription fee is a new currency that us software vendors need to get used to. There are a lot of opportunities there. Which one of you wouldn't spend $2 more on your phone bill if Verizon told you that now your phone can have access to your imaging data should you need your CT to be transferred to the best neurosurgeon in the country? Who wouldn't pay a subscription fee for being able to have access to second opinion if it's part of your benefits? It's just a new currency. Some of us abuse it. Some of us lose money at it by really financing the customer. But most of us, I think, will end up where Salesforce has ended up. So I now, and this is my fourth startup, I spend a significant amount of money on a monthly basis with Salesforce, but it's worth every dime. Every department in our company is run on Salesforce, something that we only started as lead tracking, now runs customer service. So the rest of us on the software side not only need to learn what subscription means financially, but also need to learn how do we live and produce products in the subscription world, because it certainly has a huge upside.
I'd say the flip side of the challenges on the vendor is that once you reach scale, you've got a very predictive revenue model that's strong and not as susceptible to software releases and hits or misses that you might make.
Sure. Much more steady, which is one of the reasons that as I forgot who it was who earlier said, well, I'm a SaaS company provider because now I get a higher multiple on that. But there's a higher multiple for a reason because of the predictability over time and the ability, and frankly, the ability to look forward and see things. Well, Josh, you don't often get a good sales pitch like that since Hamid runs his entire business on Salesforce now. When we first started talking about this, I know what Salesforce does. So what are you doing here in healthcare? I'd like to take a little bit of time and talk a little bit more about that because it's going to lead us to some discussions about patient engagement and the use of this data. It kind of ties back around to that consumerization point that as you think about this, what are the big things that people are thinking about and the problems they're addressing? And would certainly welcome the audience, especially now as we're getting to the point where we'll have questions fairly soon. But thinking about how the data is being used and how having access over the cloud lets us do things that we couldn't do in the past.
We started off a few years ago with our clinical push by building an EMR because obviously that's where all the froth was. And we pulled back from that pretty quickly. And the reason we got into it was because we had executives that would go to their doctor's offices and see that people are just dealing with structured data and workflows. We can do that. We can do structured data and workflows. We pulled out of that for obvious reasons. The EMR market doesn't need the 601st EMR vendor. And we've really started doing something that we're pretty excited about, and we're excited especially because the market seems like it's catching up. For those of you that don't know, in addition to the data aggregation that I told you about and the logic and workflows that have been guiding salespeople for more than a decade, we now have a social layer that we can infuse in the middle of it. Stanford Medical School put it in their entire medical school, and there's a great video if you go to their website. It's called Chatter, and it looks a lot like Facebook, but it's secure, and it's pretty cool. And when Mark Benioff announced it, he said, how come I know more about people in Facebook than I know, random strangers, than I know about things that are happening in my company? We've decreased the amount of email by about 30%. Questions get answered by the network of people that you ask one person and their network answers. There's a lot more data and knowledge. So there's a social layer in it. And I don't want to say that the social layer is a product itself. It seems like everything, as our world is changing, every application is going to have a social component to it. So if you take data and you take workflows and you take a social component, see where it fits in healthcare, that gets really fun. So I'm a family doc, and so I'm used to collaborating with a lot of other folks, and I've never really had tools to collaborate. So at Mayo, they bring a bunch of people in a room and they all talk to each other. Most other places don't do that. So how do you run a care team? How do you make sure that a patient at home is going to have someone to receive them when they get discharged? How do you make sure that the home health nurse is talking to the primary care doc or even the hospitalist who discharged them from the hospital, especially with 30-day readmits? Now we have all these big collaborations that are being imposed on folks, or they're volunteering for them, and they don't have the technology in their EHR that sits inside the hospital to have those conversations, to include patients, to include home health devices. So we've got a great collaborative platform that we have that we call Chatter for Health, and we've delivered it to some folks, and we're piloting it with some folks, and it's pretty exciting. And it allows people inside the hospital to have conversations with people outside, including patients. It allows data to come not only from the EHR, but from home health devices and other things. It allows surveys to go to patients and then query third-party databases and bring it back with risk scores and have genetic counselors put in the results and then send it back into Epic if they want to. There's a whole lot of things that can be done around continuity of care, collaboration, and really taking care of patients to produce health, not just take care of them when they're sick. And it seems like the market's finally, because of financial incentive mostly, but other reasons too, people are starting to realize that value is important and we can help that.
So Dan, are you starting to do that with your, because I would imagine that these days with more and more physicians practicing in larger groups within hospitals, the ones who are independent, many physicians who are independent, have you started to help them connect to their patients and to try to be more efficient using some of these social media type things?
Yeah, we are developing tools just in terms of portal solutions and starting to tiptoe into that in terms of enabling that patient-provider communication to happen. But frankly, a lot of what we focus on still is solving very practical problems that they have in the office. Just in terms of the core billing revenue cycle process, there's still a tremendous amount of complexity and inefficiency, and the smallest practices are the ones that are still struggling with. I don't know a small business market that's more complex to just manage a simple process of getting paid than the healthcare market is. And so a lot of what we're focused on right now is how do you bring some of those user experiences and user interfaces that make consumer software and internet services so accessible and bring that into a small business market that just happens to be healthcare providers.
And Hamid, I could easily see with radiology, again, because those are things that are shared by multiple doctors. Patients often probably don't understand exactly what they've been told in one place. How do you deal with that issue of sharing and getting information out there? And do you have a layer that lets doctors communicate directly between specialists and primary care, and as you continue to transmit more and more data through your system?
Certainly. As a matter of fact, there's a layer that we call e-referral, and that is for a good referral to come in. And believe it or not, one of the major issues in healthcare is bad referrals. All the top specialists are worried about how many patients show up in their offices and occupy time on their schedule when they could have either healed someone better or made more money or triaged the patient in advance if they had advanced information. So we're completing the cycle of where does referral start from? How do you get feedback to good, bad, or different referral? How do you ingest the data? Perhaps how do you bill it using Dan's environment? How do you use Chatter to be able to collaborate real time? So one of the advantages of cloud, I think the three of us sitting up here, is that we can have a business connecting the three together. The advantage is the 1 + 1 = 3 really is something that cloud brings to bear, and we intend to take advantage of that.
So let's talk. The next panel, I think, will be a good lead into the next panel, which is talking about mobile. And that's a piece of, obviously a piece of cloud that we can get into the mobile. But why don't we open it up and ask if people have some questions about this, about sort of how the cloud is working. Mr. Goodwin.
I had a question for Hamid. You seem to be suggesting before that the physical location of the data was important, and I would have thought that the technology transmission obviates that.
Transmission does obviate some of it, but internet is built with a lot of hiccups. Data that transfers from New York to Chicago, one moment may go through St. Louis, another moment may go through something else. With clinical data, that visualization is important. When you're a cardiologist and you're looking at an echocardiogram and you needed to look at it at 30 frames per second, you cannot afford, the data is useless when you're looking at it at 15 frames per second. So we have to take some of the unpredictability of the pattern of internet out of the equation, and the best way to do it is to park the data closest to the point of consumption and avoid some of the jumps and humps.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk of security, and is the panel familiar with a company called Axiom that processes most of the credit cards? So it's interesting to me that one of the biggest breaches of all time was a sneaker net attack with 250 million credit card accounts stolen by two plainclothes supposed security guards in a very secure vault under the ground. So is this a perception problem of the fact that the cloud is insecure? And if it's such a volatile issue, given the fact that the social culture is starting to put more and more data online about themselves, what's really the issue here with the perceived aspect of data security?
I'll start with one piece, which is I think that a lot of it is that the CIOs certainly, everybody has grown up in a certain mindset. And the mindset is you're responsible for the data that you present here. And I do think that one of the things that's happening is more people, as they realize how vulnerable their data really is. We're a law firm. We represent a lot of banks. Guess what? They want their data taken care of. And it became very quickly apparent when we had a security audit, we'd be much better off having that data in a data center because we just weren't equipped to deal with it in the way that we should. And I think many hospitals and doctors' practices are the same way. And so I think that these guys have to all be able to say, here's what we do, here's how we deal with it. But you're using encrypted connections, they're using security, they've got great physical security measures in terms of the actual facilities. One of the things Hamid said before is that it's information security. Social engineering is still, how many people here have gotten phishing attacks? They slip through everything. I had our head our head of ethics, who had just gone to see a big presentation by the FBI on law firms and data security, got something that said please click here to change your itinerary on US Air, and he clicked on it, and all of a sudden, and so because it was something like that, and the idea though was even well-informed people of goodwill are getting in trouble, but it has nothing to do with whether it's in the cloud or locally. It's that somebody has socially engineered the information out of folks.
And some of it really is, a lot of the healthcare IT information companies aren't used to operating a cloud just yet. It's like you and I can drive, but if we start driving on the other side of the road, it will take us a while to acquaint ourselves with the new phenomenon. Cerner parks the data in your data center inside the firewalls of your hospital. Now, if they want to offer a cloud anything, I want to meet the people who operate that. There is a certain level of legitimacy to being concerned. I think on the tech side, we like to promote the technology has arrived, but I'm not sure if the behavior has yet. So there is some legitimate concern there.
Anybody over here? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
A question about the subscription business model. My experience has been in talking to providers and plans that they do a good job of separating a CapEx expenditure from an ongoing expense. And I'm just wondering if maybe in your particular niches that doesn't happen, or if you're having to adjust because they say, yeah, no, the hospital has a certain capital expenditure and we can spend in one way for these systems, but not necessarily on a subscription.
For us, it's huge because if you use Salesforce, you don't have to buy servers, you don't have to buy air conditioning, you don't have to buy any of that stuff, and so all of that expenditure gets transferred to operating expense, and it's beneficial to a lot of folks. People like it.
We come across, I would say, 10% of our customers that have to buy the old-fashioned way, simply because their budgets and their CFOs have been lined up that way. So we take however much money they want to spend with us and spread it over the term and call that a license for as long as they have money to spend. We don't deviate from our subscription rate. It just, that's the way our business is made.
Do you allow them to pay up front then for a year's or 2 years
Absolutely.
subscription? There we go. There we go.
Reluctantly.
It's very good for your cash flow as well. Anything from this side of the room? Questions? Anything else from you guys? Anything else that we haven't covered that you wanted to?
I guess we were sort of talking amongst ourselves, and we were wondering, it's somewhat of a controversial subject, but I was wondering if there was anyone that, if there's anyone who doesn't believe in the cloud, or if there's anyone who thinks that it's going to revert back. It'd be interesting to know. I don't want to embarrass anyone, but.
Okay, there we go.
Okay,
there you go. Yeah. You can't resist now. Yeah, please.
Please.
So first of all, fascinating discussion. I just want to make 4 points. One is, I think, there we go. One is, I think, there are a lot of old applications out there, the workhorses of the healthcare industry, and we've rattled the names off: Siemens, Epic, McKesson, Cerner. Those apps, by and large, don't lend themselves to work in virtualized environments, which is why the starting point's very hard to consider the cloud movement. Second point is around user experience, and a lot of you talked about how it's great, we can get consumers more involved, and that's true. The newer applications are sort of built to be more consumer-friendly, web-based apps. So, and that's true. That's been true for 20 years. The users like the feature functions. The third point really is around risk. Okay, when you make a choice between sort of in-house hosted versus cloud, and I think that boils down to really. Three things. One is the system part of your core business? When it's part of the nuts and bolts of your business, you go out of business if it stops working, is you really think hard, do I want to really control that, or should I let someone else? And so just, it's just a decision. And as you get bigger with scale, and we're pretty big, we can do that. Someone who's really small, it's an easier thing to put out. If it's a secondary system.
Al, can I interrupt that point?
Yeah.
Just to ask about that, because one of the things that people talk about with that is that even if you have enough scale, is it your highest and best use to actually be running the systems internally? Because
that's actually my fourth point. My fourth point's around cost. Okay. But let me just tackle risk and then cost for a minute. So again, about risk. So if it's a secondary system, it's less of an issue. You're more apt to maybe think of not running yourself. And then the security issues are, I guess, are slowly working themselves out. I think that's less of a concern over time. But the last really then is cost. So, for example, we run, how many, take a guess, how many information systems do you think of Virtua runs? How many applications? Who wants to guess?
Hundreds.
300. It's 300. 300. So, so if I would make an all or nothing decision on 300, I would spend a whole lot of time talking to cloud vendors out there saying, can you host my 300? It would probably take about 5-6 years to slowly migrate those over to sort of vacate my centers. I actually host 4 of the applications of those 300 by the vendors themselves. I spend more, and there are 2 of them are really big. I spend more on those 2 than I do for the rest of the other 295 or something, just because it's so cost effective for me to run a data center. Again, because I have some scale, and I think I think Kevin out there in Telegard. I'm not sure if you host your own, and Aetna's here and Pfizer's here. We're talking large scale, and that's why it's just as easy to sometimes run it yourself. But I think that the tide is turning, which makes a lot of sense.
Those are really good points. One of them, the first point about these legacy systems, we're not going to unseat any of those folks. But if you look at, and you'll hear from Airstrip later on, there's a lot of stuff that's happening attaching to these old legacy systems, and a lot of that, appropriately, I think, lives in the cloud. And that's pretty interesting to us. And I think there's probably ways of working together with all these things. No one's going to rip out their Epic system. There's no cloud-based hospital EMR at this point, and there might not be for a long time, unfortunately. So basically, we all have to work with these hybrid systems, and I think that's really where a lot of the opportunities are.
Hi, yeah, I had, let's call it more of a comment than a question, but you may want to comment on it. There are a lot of parallels here to the financial services industry where, all these things have been in play for a long time, subscription models and, software as a service and cloud-based systems. The cloud is used a lot in financial services, but there are some serious concerns when you go cross-border. And it hasn't been anything discussed here because we've thought mostly about the U.S. When you start to bring in data from customers in France and customers in England, you run into all sorts of privacy rules. You run into rules about where the data has to physically reside. You run into national rules, which is the ability of a state to seize the data and say, this is now our data and we want to use it for some other purpose. So depending on where you're going with certain systems, there may be reasons outside of the technology that cause you to say, hold it a minute, I may need a federated system. I got to guarantee that this stays in my borders, doesn't leave my borders, things like that. So it's something worth thinking about as people start to design systems that may start to go global to serve a pharma company, as we talked about, or things like that.
It's a really good point. There are countries that won't allow multi-tenancy. There are countries that won't allow data to leave their borders, especially health data. There are countries that don't want anything in the United States because of the Patriot Act. These are political issues. Hopefully the cost and the technology and the innovation benefit slowly wears away at some of those policies, and education really can help.
We, in fact, address that similarly to how we park the data in San Francisco. When it's local, we park it in the EU zone when the data is coming from there. Doesn't stop us from having the brains of the operation in one place, that what's coming and what's going, but the content itself, you're absolutely right.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the counter has turned around and gone the other way, and so I get the hook out soon. So thank you for your listening.